Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together, and Hanukkah Sameach, a joyful and fulfilling eighth candle of Hanukkah. I was thinking this week about exactly how many days of miracles were there in Hanukkah. Were there eight, or was there a different number? And I realized depends upon what you mean by a miracle, because lighting that first bit of oil, well, that didn't take a miracle, did it? I mean, that was there and it was known it was going to last a day. And so we usually say that it was the additional lights of that, the fact that it lasted for 8 days instead of just one day, that was the miracle. But one might think of it this way, is that when human beings took the initiative, even in the face of what seemed like uncertainty, that unleashed a whole series of miracles. So it was that human initiative that was the lighting of the miraculous series of moments that followed. So once again, so happy to be with all of you, and we're going to have an opportunity to immerse ourselves in this great body of wisdom we call Torah. This week we are in Parshat Miketz, which begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 41, at the very beginning with verse 1. I invite everyone to go ahead and unmute yourselves, and together we can recite our blessing, giving thanks for this opportunity of coming together and immersing in the wisdom of Torah and the wisdom of one another's presence. Let us say our blessing. Baruch atah
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam
asher
asher
kitanu
kitshanu
mitzvotav
mitzvotav
v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this opportunity of coming together, immersing ourselves in these words, deeds, and presences that constitute Torah, and we're very grateful to be with one another. So we're beginning again, chapter 41 of the book of Genesis, verse 1. I'll share a few verses with you, and then I'll invite others to have an opportunity to read along as well. After 2 years' time, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And out of the Nile there came up 7 cows, handsome and sturdy, and they grazed in the reed grass. But presently 7 other cows came up from the Nile close behind them, ugly and gaunt, and stood beside the cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 handsome, sturdy cows, and Pharaoh awoke. We're now on verse 5. Margot, would you like to go ahead and read?
Sure. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, solid and healthy, grew on a single stalk. But close behind them sprouted 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 solid and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke. It was a dream. Next morning, his spirit was agitated, and he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but none could interpret them for Pharaoh. The chief cupbearer then spoke up and said to Pharaoh, I must make mention today of my offenses. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and placed me in custody in the house of the chief steward, together with the chief baker. We had dreams the same night, he and I, each of us a dream with meaning of its own. A Hebrew youth was there with us, a servant of the chief steward, and when we told him our dreams, he interpreted them for us, telling each of the meaning of his dreams. And as he interpreted for us, so it came to pass. I was restored to my post, and the others were impaled.
Thank you, Margot. And then let me ask Jim and Peggy, would you like to begin reading at verse 14?
Okay. Am I unmuted? Yeah. Thereupon Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was rushed from the dungeon. He had his hair cut and changed his clothes, and he appeared before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now I have heard it said of you that for you to hear a dream is to tell its meaning. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, not I, God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the Nile came up 7 sturdy and well-formed cows and grazed in the reed grass. Presently, there followed them 7 other cows, scrawny, ill-formed, and emaciated. Never had I seen their likes for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. And the 7 lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 cows, the sturdy ones. But when they had consumed them, one could not tell that they had consumed them, for they looked just as bad as before. And I awoke. In my other dream, I saw 7 ears of grain, full and healthy, growing on a single stalk. But right behind them sprouted 7 ears, shriveled, thin, and scorched by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 healthy ears. I have told my magicians, but none has an explanation for me.
And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows are 7 years, and the 7 healthy ears are 7 years. It is the same dream. The 7 lean and ugly cows that followed are 7 years, as are also the 7 empty ears scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I have told Pharaoh. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Immediately ahead are 7 years of great abundance in all the land of Egypt. After them will come 7 years of famine, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. As the land is ravaged by famine, no trace of the abundance will be left in the land because of the famine thereafter, for it will be very severe. As for Pharaoh having had the same dream twice, it means that the matter has been determined by God and that God will soon carry it out.
Thank you both so much. Steve, would you like to begin reading at verse 33?
Let Pharaoh now select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh act and appoint administrators over the land, and let him take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. Have them gather up all the surplus of food of these good years that are coming, and let them store up grain in the cities under Pharaoh's control and put it under guard. The food will then be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will prevail in the land of Egypt. Thus, the land will not perish through famine. This advice seemed good to Pharaoh and his officials, and Pharaoh said to his officials, is there anyone like this to be found, a man with the Spirit of God in him? Pharaoh then said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my household, and all my people shall obey your word. Only I, the throne, shall be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, observe, I have placed you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. He dressed him in linen trappings and placed the gold chain of office around his neck. He gave him his viceroy's chariot to ride. They cried out, royal steward. Before him, he placed him in charge of all the land of Egypt.
Thank you, Steve. Robin, would you like to read beginning at verse 44?
Pharaoh now said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without you none shall lift hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh called Joseph Zephanath Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as a wife. Thus Joseph came to be in charge of the land of Egypt. When Joseph began to serve Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he was 30 years old. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traversed the whole land of Egypt. In the 7 years of plenty, the land produced to overflowing. He gathered all the surplus food there was in the land of Egypt from the 7 years. He placed food in the cities. The food that came from a city's surrounding fields he placed in its midst. Thus Joseph heaped up grain as plentiful as the sands of the sea, until he left off measuring, for it was beyond measure. 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived, born to him by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Joseph named the firstborn son Manasseh, for God has made me forget all the troubles I endured in my father's house. And he named the second one Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
Thank you so much. Wayne, would you like to begin reading at verse 53?
Yes, thank you. And the 7 years of the bountifulness that was in the land of Egypt finished, and the 7 years of famine started to come. And Joseph had said, and there was famine in all the lands, and in all the land of Egypt there was bread, and all the land of Egypt hungered. And the people cried to Pharaoh for the bread. And Pharaoh said to all Egypt, go to Joseph, do what he'll tell you. And the famine was on all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened everything that was in them and sold to Egypt. And the famine was strong in the land of Egypt. And all the earth came to Egypt to buy to Joseph, because the famine was strong in all the earth. And Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, why do you look at each other? And he said, here I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy grain for us from there, and we'll live and not die. And 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. And Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, because he said, in case some harm will happen to him. And the sons of Israel came to buy among those who were coming, because the famine was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the one in charge over the land. He was the one who sold grain to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brother came and bowed to him, noses to the ground. And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them. And he made himself unrecognizable to them. And he spoke with them in hard tones. And he said to them, from where have you come? And they said, from the land of Canaan, to buy food.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Richard, would you like to begin reading at verse 8?
Yes, thank you. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew not him. And Joseph remembered this dream he dreamed of them, and said unto them, ye are spies, to seek the nakedness of the land ye are come. And they said unto him, nay, my lord, but to buy food are they servants come. We are all one man's sons. We are upright men. Thy servants are no spies. And he said unto them, nay, but to see the nakedness of the land ye are come. And they said, why, thy servants are 12 brethren, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not. And Joseph said unto them, that is it that I spoke unto you, saying, ye are spies. Hereby ye shall be proved. As Pharaoh liveth, ye shall not go forth hence, except your youngest brother come hither. Send one of you, and let him fetch your brother, and ye shall be bound, that your words may be proved, whether there be truth in you, or else, as Pharaoh liveth, surely you are spies. And he put them all together into ward these 3 days. And Joseph said unto them the 3rd day, this do and live, for I fear God. If ye be upright men, let one of your brethren be bound in your prison house. But go ye, carry corn for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother unto me. So shall your words be verified, and ye shall not die. And they did so, and they said to one another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore it is this distress come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, Spoke I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child? And ye would not hear. Therefore also, behold, his blood is required. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for the interpreter was between them. And he turned himself about from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them and took Simeon from among them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph commanded to fill the vessels with corn and to restore every man's money into his sack and to give them provisions for the way. And thus was it done unto them. And they laded their asses with their corn and departed thence. And as one of them opened his sack to give his ass provisions in the lodging place, he espied his money. And behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. And he said unto his brethren, my money is restored, and lo, it is even in my sack. And his heart failed him. And they returned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God hath done unto me?
Thank
And
you.
they came unto Jacob their father into
Richard,
the land.
Richard, let me invite
Sure.
Dave to read next. Thank you so much. It's really beautiful. And Dave, would you like to read beginning of verse 29?
They came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him all that had befallen them, saying, the man who was Lord of the land spoke harshly to us, accused us of spying on the land. We said to him, we are honest men. We have never been spies. There were 12 of us brothers, sons by the same father, but one is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in the land of Canaan. But the man who is the Lord of the land said to us, by this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me and take something for your starving households and be off. And bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. I will then restore your brother to you, and you shall be free to move about in the land. As they were emptying their sacks there, in each one's sacks was his money bag. And when they and their father saw the money bags, they were dismayed. Their father Jacob said to them, it is always me that you bereave. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take away Benjamin. These things always happen to me. Then Reuben said to his father, you may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. But he said, my son must not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If he meets with disaster on the journey that you are taking, you will send my white head down to Sheol in grief.
Thank you so much, Dave. Susan and David, would you like to begin reading at chapter 43?
Thank you.
Famine bore heavily on the land, and when they had consumed the provisions they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, go back and buy us a bit of food. But Judah said to him, the man adjured us most definitely, saying, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you're willing to let our brother go with us, we'll go down and buy food for you. But if you are not willing to let him go, we will not go down. The man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. Israel then said, why did you do me this wrong? Answering the man's question, have you yet another brother? They answered, the man questioned us closely about ourselves and our family, saying, is your father still alive? Do you have a brother? So we answered as required by these questions. How on earth could we have known that he would say, bring your brother down?
And Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy with me so we may go up, and we'll live and not die, we and you and our infants as well. I'll be security for him. You'll seek him from my hand. If I don't bring him to you and set him before you, then I'll have sinned against you for all time. For if we hadn't delayed, by now we could have come back twice. And Israel, their father, said to him, if that's how it is, then do this. Take some of the best fruit of the land in your containers and take a gift down to the man, a little balm and a little honey, gum and myrrh, pistachios and almonds. And take double the silver in your hand, and take back in your hand the silver that was put back in the mouth of your bags. Maybe it was a mistake. And take your brother and get up, go back to the man. And may El Shaddai give you mercy before the man, so that he'll send your other brother and Benjamin to you. And if I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Susan. Kim, would you like to begin reading at verse 15?
Had to unmute. And the men took this tribute and doubled the silver that they took in their hand. And Benjamin and they rose and went down to Egypt and stood in Joseph's presence. And Joseph saw Benjamin with them, and he said to the one who was over his house, bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal and prepare it, for with me the men shall eat at noon. And the man did as Joseph had said, and the man brought the men to Joseph's house. And the men were afraid at being brought to Joseph's house, and they said, because of the silver put back in our bags, the first time we've been brought in order to fall upon us, to attack us, and to take us as slaves and our donkeys. And they approached the man who was over Joseph's house, and they spoke to him by the entrance of the house. And they said, please, my lord, we indeed came down the first time to buy food. And it happened when we came to the encampment that we opened our bags, and look, each man's silver was in the mouth of his bag, our silver in full weight, and we have brought it back in our hand, and we have brought down more silver to buy food. We do not know who put our silver in our bags. And he said, all is well with you, do not fear. Your God and the God of your father has placed treasure for you in your bags. Your silver has come to me. And he brought Simeon out to them. And the man brought the men into Joseph's house, and he gave them water, and they bathed their feet. And he gave provender to their donkeys. And they prepared the tribute against Joseph's arrival at noon, for they had heard that they would eat bread. And Joseph came into the house, and they brought him the tribute that was in their hand into the house. And they bowed down to him to the ground. And he asked how they were. And he said, is all well with your aged father of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? And they said, all is well with your servant, our father. He is still alive. And they did obeisance and bowed down. And he raised his eyes and saw Benjamin, his brother, his mother's son. And he said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. And Joseph hurried out, for his feelings for his brother overwhelmed him, and he wanted to weep. And he went into the chamber and wept there. And he bathed his face and came out and held himself in check and said, serve bread. And they served him and them separately. And the Egyptians who were eating with him separately, for the Egyptians would not eat bread with the Hebrews, as it was abhorrent to Egypt. And they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, the youngest according to his youth. And the men marveled to each other. And he had portions passed to them from before him. And Benjamin's portion was 5 times more than the portions of all the rest. And they drank and they got drunk with him.
Thank you so much, Kim. Jay, would you like to unmute and read beginning, start of chapter 44?
Then he instructed his house steward as follows. Fill the men's bags with food, as much as they can carry, and put each one's money in the mouth of the bag. Put my silver goblet in the mouth of the bag of the youngest one, together with his money for the rations. And he did as Joseph told him. With the first light of morning, the men were sent off with their pack animals. They had just left the city and had not gone far when Joseph said to his steward, Up, go after the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, Why did you repay good with evil? It is the very one from which my master drinks and which he uses for divination. It was a wicked thing for you to do. He overtook them and spoke those words to them. He said to him, Why does my Lord say such things? For be it from your servants to do anything, far be it from your servants to do anything of the kind. Here we brought back to you from the land of Canaan the money that we found in the mouths of our bags. How then could we have stolen any silver or gold from your master's house? Whichever of your servants is found with shall die. Whichever of your servants it is found with shall die. The rest of us, moreover, shall become slaves to my Lord. He replied, Although what you are proposing is right, only the one with whom it is found shall be my slave, but the rest of you shall go free. So each one hastened to lower his bag to the ground, and each one opened his bag. He searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest. And the goblet turned up in Benjamin's bag, and at this they rent their clothes. Each reloaded the pack animal, and they returned to the city.
Thank you so much, Jay. Justin, would you like to read beginning at verse 14?
When Judah arrived with his brothers to Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell to the ground before him. Joseph said to him, What is this deed that you have done? Do you not realize that a man like me practices divination? So Judah said, What can we say, my Lord? How can we speak? And how can we justify ourselves? God has uncovered the sin of your servants. Here we are. We are ready to be slaves to my Lord, both we and the one whose hand the goblet was found. But he replied, It would be sacrilegious for me to do this. The man in whose possession the goblet was found, only he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up in peace to your father.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you very much, everyone. That's our Torah portion for the week. Indeed, a very dramatic story ending at a very dramatic point, which we'll conclude with next week. I'd just like to share a little focused study with you and then invite everyone to share with me what interested you, provoked you, made you curious, what you'd like to reflect about this week's portion. I'd like to start out by focusing on the graphic that I shared with you on the study sheet that was distributed. It's a painting, acrylic on canvas, by a rather young Russian artist who lives in St. Petersburg, Dmitry Matkovsky. And the name of his piece is called Fear into Courage Transformation, Day 1. One of the first things that caught my attention actually was the title itself, Fear into Courage Transformation, period, Day 1, indicating to me that there indeed is a day 2, that transformation doesn't happen just once, that it is required to happen on a daily occurrence. And indeed, there are further days in his series about fear into courage transformation. What also interests me is that when he presents his work, which seems to be full of all kinds, the way I look at it, full of all kinds of dynamics and almost confusion as well as great color. Indeed, he speaks about in his writing about his works being fascinated with the synesthesia we've talked about and written about previously, that notion about this cooperation of all kinds of senses, that one sense provokes another sense, and that one sense can be described through the language of another sense. But in his presentation about this particular painting, Fear into Courage Transformation, Day 1, he has a quote from the great Protestant theologian of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, from his book, The Courage to Be. And in that book, Paul Tillich writes this: the basic anxiety, the anxiety of a finite being about the threat of non-being, cannot be eliminated. It belongs to existence itself. So this notion about we as finite beings have within us, as just a necessary aspect of existence, this fear of non-being, that it is possible for us, not only possible for us, but we are constantly haunted by the fact that we exist and then suddenly we might not exist. And that haunting fear can cause us to react and deal with it in many different ways. And we see these many different ways actually in Torah itself. Torah is in fact teaching us a lot about how to deal with that anxiety that's inherent in being a finite being, that anxiety that all of a sudden might not be. In one way of dealing with that anxiety, we've seen at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, and that is to overimpose oneself on others. That's one reaction to this anxiety, to insist upon being, to overcome the anxiety by overimposing oneself, even if it means the elimination of another. And in a sense, perhaps that's what's happening. That's what happens with Cain and Abel. And that's what happens in many other stories that we read about in Torah, where that concern that I'm mortal, I'm always on the verge, the cusp of non-existence, and my way for compensating for that is to excessively impose my presence so that I might exist. And one way of existing is by eliminating the others around me. So that's, we're going to see how that sense of anxiety about existence comes up in this week's Torah portion. And the title for this week's study session is Fear and Faith. That anxiety which leads to fear, which then causes people to deal with that fear in many different ways. And one aspect of it, or one resolution of it, has something to do with faith. But we'll see what the notion of faith is really all about. And it might be different within the Jewish tradition than it is in some other traditions. We'll see as we go through our course of study this evening. But that notion about non-beingness, I want to suggest, is one of the dominant themes in this week's Torah portion and in last week's Torah portion. And that is seen in the verses. And if I could just ask people to go on mute for just a little bit so we can cut down on some of the background. Thank you. One of the ways it shows up is in a series of verses that we see in commentary in number 1 here. So from last week's Torah portion, this moment when Joseph was thrown into the pit, and then he's sold into slavery, and then we have the brothers. One of the brothers comes back. We have, I believe it is Reuben, who comes back and sees that Joseph is no longer in the pit, that the other brothers have sold him off into slavery. And he says, the boy is Einenu. Now where shall I go? The word Einenu, which actually Richard read with, I felt great emotion tonight. That word Einenu comes from the word ein, which means not. So the boy is Einenu. Something about the boy is not, or the boy is now notness, or something like that. We'll delve into that notion about what it means in just a moment. And then in chapter 42, where the brothers are now saying to Joseph, although they don't recognize that it's Joseph, they are talking about the family, and they're talking about Benjamin, because the grand vizier, who's actually Joseph, who says, do you have a younger brother? And he says, the youngest is now with our father, and one is Einenu. They're talking about Joseph there. Joseph is Einenu. And then Jacob, when it's reported, when they report to him, now we have to, the brothers say to their father Jacob, we have to take Benjamin down there to see the grand vizier of Egypt. He insists upon our bringing Benjamin back if we're going to get food. And Jacob says, you have bereaved me. Joseph is Einenu, and Simeon is Einenu, because he was left down there in prison. And then when Joseph, acting as the grand vizier, says to the brothers, you must leave Benjamin with me. You can return, bring your father back here, but you have to leave Benjamin here. And the brothers say, when he, Jacob, sees that the boy is Einenu with us, he will die. So a couple of things here. First of all, this word ein, meaning not, is used in various forms at least 6 times between chapter 37 and chapter 42. It's obviously a key word meant to convey some deep meaning here. And this notion about Einenu, which in the first recitation there, the boy is Einenu, now where shall I go? Which is spoken by Reuben. There's something about Joseph's now disappearance is now having some reverberations on him. Joseph's absence is now having an impact on Reuben. Now what do I do? Joseph is Einenu. What now? Now it's going to reverberate on me. So this notion about Einenu is an absence, a distinct kind of absence, I think. It's an absence which is unresolved. It's not like death. In fact, we'll see that. Let's look at the last citation there. And this is after it's been reported to Jacob that Joseph is Einenu, he's gone. And Jacob says, it says about Jacob, he refused to be comforted. And about that, our medieval commentator Rashi says, this is interesting. What does that mean? He refused to be comforted upon learning that Jacob had, as the brothers say, been killed by a wild beast. Because Rashi says this doesn't make sense, because a person does not accept consolation over a live person. Meaning that Jacob senses that this absence is not just a death. Because when someone dies, you accept consolation, you go into mourning. And that process of mourning helps you deal with and seek some kind of resolution about the end of that person's life. That person is no longer with you. But the fact that Jacob refused to accept consolation says to Rashi, Jacob sensed that Joseph's disappearance was not a mere death that could be easily resolved through a mourning period and accepting consolation. it was a disturbance that was deep within his soul because it was somehow mysterious and unresolved. There is a kind of reverberating absence that bothers the soul, this enenu. So this is this dominant theme here, I think, in this week's Torah portion about this notion about enenu, a kind of absence that shakes everyone and has a reverberating consequence around everyone that somehow can't be resolved through the normal rituals of mourning and consolation. So we're going to look at how Jacob and then later Joseph deals with this notion about this reverberating absence, which is an unresolved disturbance of the universe itself, if you will. So it's lovely. As we were reading through this, we read this, the narration about Jacob says, I hear that there's corn down in Egypt. Go down and get us some corn. So we're going to, and the word that's used there for corn is shever, which means a grain. Okay? It's corn, it's food. That's what the word shever is easily translated as. But we're going to look at a midrash, which plays with those three letters that get articulated in our Torah portion, shever, meaning corn or grain. And what the midrash is going to do is it's going to take those same three letters and it's going to say, in addition to the word shever, there is also the word using the same three letters but articulate slightly different. Instead of shever, sever. Same three letters, okay, but with different vowels, different vocalization, which is, we just take a step back for a moment and we say, we're looking at the same phenomenon, these same three letters, the same shapes, but they're vocalized differently. One way to think about that is it's possible to look for different people to look at the same phenomenon and experience something quite different. And that's what the midrash is going to be playing with. We take these same three letters, shever, sever. Okay, so this is what the word sever means hope. It comes from the Hebrew verb savar, which means to inspect, to examine, to wait for something, to hope for something. And the word shever, which gets translated as corn, actually comes from the Hebrew verb shavar, which means to break into pieces. And you can see how the word grain or corn might come from that verb to break into little pieces, okay? So this notion about brokenness and hope is what this midrash is going to play with. So it quotes the verse from our Torah portion. Jacob saw that there was shever in Egypt. And then the midrash is now going to quote from Psalm 146, which says, happy is the one whose hope, sever, is in Adonai his God. And the midrash goes on. There was shever in Egypt, and there was sever. There was shever, for Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. There was sever, for Joseph became the ruler. Meaning, in this case, there was shever in Egypt, meaning not so much the corn or grain, but looking at the original verb form, there was brokenness, okay? And there was also sever, plenty, because there was food down there. There was shever in their personal lives because Joseph had been broken away from the family. But there was also sever because Joseph had become the ruler. And the midrash is suggesting that Jacob is actually aware of this dialectic that's happening. He's aware, according to the midrash, that it is both the shever, the brokenness, and there's the sever, the hope. So this relationship between brokenness and hope, between a shattering and new possibilities, is what the Midrash is trying to make us aware of. That there's a condition, that where there's a condition of wholeness and security, who needs hope, right? There's a contemporary Christian writer named Philip Yancey, who writes a lot of books about spirituality, who says something similar. He says, in the presence of certainty, who needs faith? Okay? And that's from his book, Reaching for the Invisible God, What Do We Expect to Find? So as I was studying this notion about the combination of brokenness and hope, I thought of Kabbalah. It hadn't occurred to me before this. But in Kabbalah, we have this really key concept called Shivirat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels. Same word. Shivirat comes from the same word, brokenness and shattering. So the question is this notion that when creation was brought about, that the vessels were too fragile to be able to hold all the emanation of the divine that was then flowing into this dimension. And these vessels shattered, and now we have these shards that are now embedded in this reality. And one of the tasks of being a human being is to gather up these broken shards and put them back together, okay? So the question is that shattering of the vessels at the time of creation, was that a catastrophe or was that an opportunity? Is that a catastrophe for the divine, a catastrophe for the universe? Or does that represent an opportunity for humanity to begin to put things back together and to participate and in the creation of the world? So I think that's part of what the Midrash is also pointing at here, that where there's brokenness, there's also a unique opportunity for creating something brand new, a new possibility. So now that's a little bit about how the Midrash is now indicating Jacob is addressing this notion about the anxiety of einenu, of non-existence. The Midrash is suggesting that Jacob somehow senses that there's new possibility embedded in this shattering that has occurred. So let's look at what Joseph here is doing. If you turn over on the study sheet, we have what we read today. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them and he made himself strange to them. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. It's a curious formulation of what Joseph is doing here. He recognizes them and makes himself strange to them. So we have this Hebrew here, Nachar, which means to be unknown, strange, Nicher, to treat as a stranger, and Nochri is a stranger. But we also have, based upon the same Hebrew, the word hikir, to recognize or know, kar, to be recognized. In other words, the Hebrew is saying there's some kind of dialectical relationship between estrangement and being recognized. Joseph goes through this peculiar ritual of somehow making himself increasingly unknown to his brothers as part of a process of becoming known to them. The estrangement seems to be an essential stage in reaching a higher level of repair and reuniting with the brothers. Let's look at a little bit for just a couple more minutes at the notion of faith. But the question is, what is faith? So in some religious traditions, one might think of faith having something to do with absolute certainty, to have a sense of constant assurance that all will work out. Faith might be thought of as really kind of a submission and acceptance and an embrace and a confidence, if you will. I want to suggest that the notion of faith is a little different within the Jewish tradition. I'd like to begin this next couple of minutes with a quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks from his book, Dignity of Difference. And he wrote, "The test of faith is whether I can make a space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideals are different than mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing him to make me in his."
Oh, wow.
So what Rabbi Sacks is saying is something along the lines of faith has to do with not a sense of certainty about what is before me. It has to do with an opening up to the mystery and the wonder of what is before me, is making myself vulnerable. So here's Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau, if you remember, Jacob steals the birthright and he gets the blessing from the father. That was really due to Esau. In a sense, he displaces Esau so that he can assume a place of greater privilege within the family. And then much later, some 20 years later, he has this wrestling match with this unknown being. And as a result of that wrestling match, he ends up being able to encounter Esau and say, I have everything. I've got, it really was beautiful. I have everything. I'm complete now because I have done this wrestling. And in the course of it, Jacob is injured. So he carries with him this imperfection, which is still somehow part of the process of becoming complete. And Joseph, too, he engages early on in his life with these dreams when he's still living at home, and he tells his brothers the dream that he has, and then he tells his parents about another dream that he has, and they all require these other older members of the family, including his parents, to kind of acknowledge in a way his superiority within the family. So Joseph initially indulges and uses this gift that he's got of dreams and interpreting dreams in a way that diminishes others and causes discord within the family. It's not until after he's gone through all these diminishments of his own, of being thrown into a pit, of then ending up being thrown into prison, before he can begin to use that gift in a way that brings fulfillment, because he uses the dream no longer to advance himself, he uses his dreams on behalf of others. So here is the interesting bit of, I think, wisdom and insight that the Hebrew teaches us about faith in Judaism. Because the word for faith in Hebrew is emunah. And the word emunah comes from the verb aman, which means to confirm or support. And aman is a master craftsperson, an artist. And amon is an architect. There's something that the Hebrew is teaching us about the nature of faith in the Jewish tradition, which is that it's not about a passive submission. It's not about acceptance. Faith in the Jewish tradition is a construction project. And it's about constructing relationships with others by making space for others, by opening up oneself, by making oneself vulnerable, by enlarging space so that others can have presence in which one will share and participate, from which one will learn. Again, returning to Rabbi Sachs, the test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who's not in my image, whose faith, language, ideals are different from mine? If I can't do that, then I've made God in my image instead of allowing him to remake me in his. So with that, I'd like to invite others to share with me what spoke to you about this week's Torah portion. What fascinated you? What interested you? What made you curious? And so, Margot.
I have a question first and then my comment. And when they have the meal together, and it makes a point of saying the Egyptians would not eat with the Jews. And I wonder if that's foreshadowing for what is to come. Because there seemed to be an enmity that the Egyptians felt toward the Jews. And it's in 29 or 32. But
So beautiful, Margot. So think about how you have just built upon what Rabbi Sachs has offered to us, right?
yeah.
Rabbi Sachs is the test of faith, as we understand faith, is whether I can make space for difference. But instead, what the Egyptians are doing, as it's being described here, is these Hebrews are people we want nothing to do with. We want to push them away from us, right? And so that's the very opposite. That is the opposite of what we would call holy, right? That's the opposite of what we would call building sacred relationships. That is building up these barriers. Yes, and these barriers are what's going to eventually cause the downfall of this empire.
But my comment is on the Einenu. You know, people lose loved ones sometimes through violence perpetrated by others. And, you know, they can't really grieve until they have the body of the loved ones back, because they think that maybe the loved one is still alive. And, you know, they said you can't mourn for a live person. And, you know, often they catch one of these serial killers, I'm sorry to be morbid, a serial killer who will reveal where many graves are, and people can retrieve the bodies of their loved ones, and then they can truly grieve.
Thank you, Margo. Thank you for bringing that in. Thank you. And Wayne?
I think what affected me most before I heard your commentary was the interpretation by Joseph of the dream of Pharaoh, of foreshadowing this famine. And I got to thinking that, was that not a normal practice of the Egyptians, of anyone, to make sure you save up in the good years, because there are going to be lean years? And I thought that was an incredible lesson for all of us, to know that good fortune is not guaranteed, and we have to prepare for the fact that we might have things that will happen in our lives, bad luck, lose our job, make a bad investment, whatever it might be, and we have to have a reserve just in case that happens.
You know, Wayne, I also thought about this week that Joseph is this fascinating character because he is both a dreamer and one of the greatest technocrats of all times. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there are people who are great visionaries, but who have incapacity to realize through all the mundane steps that we need to follow to realize a dream. And so it's fascinating to think about Joseph as this character who is a visionary, a dreamer, and he seems to be the consummate administrator in making it all happen. So I look at you as I think about that. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Other thoughts, Dave? And then I'll get to David Phillips, but let me get to Dave Lid first.
The talk of famine makes me realize that here we are in the land of plenty, and there is still famine in our land.
Amongst us, amidst.
Thank you, Dave. It's just so disturbing to see these long lines of people. I read just a really sad article in today's New York Times about the extent to which there is hunger on military bases in the United States today, that people have to go to food banks on military bases in the United States. People who are serving in the military. Shameful. Dave Phillips?
What you said about shever being grain, but also related to the shattering and the shards, has transformed the way I think of the shards embedded and floating and flying around as being both grains of food and seeds. And I had not looked at them in that fashion before.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you, Dave. Susan, did you have something? Yeah.
I've always been so upset about
her husband was pressing the wrong things.
I've always been so upset about Joseph and his treatment of his brothers, because now he was in a position of power and they were not. And then tonight with your Sever and Shever, it made me think of Joseph as being broken by what had happened to him, by his life that he had lived. And he didn't know, he didn't understand, he couldn't figure out how to treat his brothers, what to do. And it confused him to where he confused them. He just withdrew and did pranks and things that would make everybody uncomfortable, and it must have made him uncomfortable too.
Susan, very beautiful. Thank you. There's a beautiful little interpretation by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who is 19th century rabbi, considered the founder of modern Orthodoxy. And he looks at the name of one of Joseph's sons, Menashe, which we read here and which is usually understood to mean, God has made me forget my past. Okay, that's the way it's usually understood. But Rabbi Hirsch says there's another meaning, and that's from the Hebrew word nasha, which means to forget. But Rabbi Hirsch says there's another meaning to those same letters, nasha, which nasha as a verb also means to become a creditor. And so Rabbi Hirsch focuses on that understanding of those three letters and says what's happening here, whether Joseph is aware of it or not, is he's acknowledging that all the troubles and all the difficulties in his childhood that he experienced, which he at the time thought was just so tragic, either he's consciously or unconsciously acknowledging that they actually played a critical role in his ultimate fulfillment. That he owes something to those experiences. He's a creditor to those experiences. And whether or not, as Susan pointed out, whether or not he's fully cognizant and conscious that he owes something to all those difficulties in his childhood and his growing up and his past experience, there's something within him, according to Rabbi Hirsch, that has an awareness that he owes something for all his experiences to now being in the place of sovereignty that he is. So thank you, Steve. Jay.
Once again, we have a flawed character in Joseph who has been abused, as was Abraham. Isaac with the knife over him and being bound up as a youth. And now we have someone whose brothers threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery. I mean, you've got a lot of PTSD working here. I think he plays it out with his brothers in a situation where he's not, I think maybe it's that he's not getting back at them. I think that he's trying to teach them a lesson, that even though you did this to me, and even though I have every reason to wipe you off the face of the earth, I owe it to myself, I owe it to my father, and I owe it to God to treat you differently than I treat other strangers coming in here. I'm gonna toy around a little bit. I'm gonna make you wonder. I'm gonna make you think. I'm gonna make you delve into why is this happening? What's going on? And maybe now, as it says towards the end, did it not say that now they were starting to feel that God was getting back at them for what they had done? I can't, it's been about 15 minutes since we finished reading. It's late in the evening, so I don't remember, but I think that's what Joseph is coming to terms with it in the next, and I just, don't be a spoiler alert, but does Jacob actually come down to Egypt? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert? He does?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, he does come.
Yeah. But Jay, you've reminded us that what the Torah itself is constantly trying to remind us, which is that we're all fractured human beings. And sometimes, as we talked about at the very beginning, sometimes the way we compensate for that sense of fracture is to hurt others and ourselves even more than we've already been hurt. And there is another way that can seek integration. And the only way to seek that integration is to understand the extent to which we're fractured. Okay. And that begins the healing process, as Rabbi Sachs says, to the extent that we now no longer seek to hurt others as a way to give expression to our hurt, but that we open ourselves up to others. That's part of the healing process, which ultimately is what happens, spoiler alert, with Joseph and his brother. He opens himself up rather than using his position of power over others to hurt them even more. Yeah, thank you.
One response which just came to mind, remember the position that Joseph is in now. He does not want to do more harm. These Egyptians already don't want to eat with the Hebrews. Okay, so by identifying himself at that moment, hey, these are my brothers. They came down here to we're going to have a good time here in Egypt. He's got a very slippery slope there in his position as the, what is he, viceroy or?
Yeah.
So he's also, as you said, he's a penultimate manager of many things, taking into account a lot. So part of this is these servants and all of him and saying, this must be something going on here, but they never ever suspect that he was dealing with his brothers. They just, but had that slipped, I think great calamity might have befallen to him and to his brothers. So it just seems, and the other thing is that that you brought in this fracturedness when you do have a drought, when you do have all of this, the land becomes fractured, your structures become fractured. You have to seek out a fix, or at least something to get you through it. And that's what Jacob says, go down and help us fix this. So there's how many more meanings are we going to find on the head of this pin, Rabbi?
It's a big pin. Yeah, Richard.
Well, Leonard Cohen says there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
Amen, brother.
And a couple things about Joseph. One is, the games he's playing. All these brothers have played games with one another about who's the first and who's the second and who's holding on to whose heel and who's taking whose portion and so forth and so on. Well, Joseph and Benjamin is an interesting pairing, because Joseph, recall how when Jacob saw Rachel, how strong that connection was. And Benjamin's his little brother, and he wants to see Benjamin. And then at the very beginning, you talked about emptiness or disappearing. You're not there anymore. There's no corpse, but we're empty inside, and we have this existential concern about what does it mean to be empty, what it means to be not have the garment of our body. And throughout Joseph's story, he's had all these garments. He had the garment his father gave him, and then that garment indicated there was a dead body somewhere. And then Potiphar took that garment and said he's an adulterer. And then he gets the cloak of the viceroy. But where is Joseph? Is there anybody really in there? Is he not always, he never says he's God. He said, God will answer the question for you. And they believe he has the Spirit of God in him, or the Spirit, whatever it is. And Pharaoh thought that because he interpreted the dream. God will answer it for you. And all, well, maybe he's God. So it's almost as though Joseph, whoever Joseph is not here anywhere. There are all these different garments and stuff that this being does. And I don't know what that means.
And if you remember, there's another garment in last week's Torah portion as well. That's the garment that Tamar wears.
Yes.
That she wears as a way to conceal herself in order to bring someone into himself.
And who does she bring? She brings David.
Eventually, that's right. Eventually, as a result of all that, David comes about. So I want to just first of all say how rich and wonderful it is for me to study with all of you, to acknowledge that tonight we have lit the 8th candle of Hanukkah. And real quickly, it occurred to me that in reading this week's Torah portion, the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of lack, I thought number 7 represents this reality that we're all in. This reality in which there is sometimes fulfillment and sometimes loss, sometimes plenty, sometimes lack. That's what this world is always going to be like. There will always be these moments in which there's going to be these cycles in our own personal lives, in our social lives, of having enrichment and having impoverishment, having gain, having loss. The question is, how do we deal with those moments of enrichment? How do we deal with those moments of loss? The number 8 in Jewish tradition is that dimension that's beyond all of this, that's beyond those cycles of enrichment and loss. It's in that dimension where all there is the unity that we all see. And the blessing is that we have this holiday that allows us to experience it. And how do we get to that holiday? How do we get to that 8th day? By taking the first step, lighting that first candle. That human initiative is what opens up this ladder of miracles that takes us to the 8th dimension. So I'm so enriched by all of you. God bless you all. May you have a good evening, a good week. I look forward to our studying again. Thank you so much. Be well, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Lala Tov.
Thank you.
Sometimes, Rabbi.
Beautiful, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.